Okay, continuing here in the chapter on civil liberties, we're beginning with slide number 43, talking about obscenity. What we need to understand, again, with a lot of these is the court has intended, in the modern era, has tended to broaden expression, whether it's speech, whether it's symbolic speech, and in the case of obscenity, it's done the same, okay? And it's an expression of the general permissiveness in our culture, okay? So if you look at slide 43, it talks about obscenity. Generally, the court has used a three-pronged test. They developed it in the case of Miller versus California. How is something considered obscene? Okay, number one, it must depict sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. Number two, material must be described in the law as obscene. In other words, they're looking at the law and what's written in statutes and things like that. And number three, material taken as a whole must appeal to prurient interest. It must have no redeeming social value. Okay, now one could say, well, there's a lot of obscenity that has no social value whatsoever. But it's interesting how the court has had to, like one of the Supreme Court justices said this. He said, I will know pornography when I see it. I can't explain to you what it is, but I'll know it when I see it. Okay, which is, kind of subjective. So, again, not going to belabor these too much, but on slide number 44, again, think of the permissiveness of the courts in the recent era. In 1969, would adults read and watch in the privacy of their home cannot be made a crime. Osborne versus Ohio, 1990, it upheld a law making it a crime to possess pornographic photos of children. United States versus William in 2008, it upheld a 2003 federal statute that makes it a crime to offer or solicit child pornography, even if the material is based on a computer-generated or digitally altered image that merely appears to be those of children. And then the Denver Area Consortium versus Federal Communications Commission in 1996. In other cases, the court struck down some congressional restrictions on the transmission of sexually explicit material children might see on the grounds that they would ban material that adults have a constitutional right to see if they so choose. Okay, in other words, they're thinking as well, adults could see this stuff. Even if kids see it, we know that that's wrong. But if there's a slight chance that adults could see it, along with the kids, we're going to defer to the adults. Okay, again, much more permissive as a culture, much more permissive in how the courts have chosen to interpret obscenity. Okay, moving on here, slide 45, right to bear arms. There's two cases that deal with this, and these are more recent ones. Bottom line is the court has sided with the right to bear arms. Okay, is that they've chosen to basically view it as, listen, one of the reasons why the framers gave us the right to bear arms is because, just like all the other Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights, the right to bear arms is shielding the individual from the power of the federal government. Again, the argument that the founders made was, if people are armed, the government's going to be less likely to try to mess with them. Okay? In Europe, a lot of these, kings, these monarchs would take away, the right of citizens to bear arms. In many totalitarian countries today, the state takes away the arms of the citizens so they can control the citizens. And so the court in these two cases, District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago, decided to preserve the right to bear arms, because the logic was, it's a shield of protection between the individual and the federal government. Okay. Moving on here in slide number 46, the right to privacy. Okay, when we're talking about the right to privacy, where we get the constitutionality of abortion, where we get the constitutionality of homosexual practices, okay? It's not in the Constitution. Again, you could spend many fruitless hours looking for it, you will not find it. It is a judicially created right, okay? The court actually created it. It's actually been around since 1890, when Louis Brandeis wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review talking about the right to privacy. But it's this idea that there's a sphere of privacy around you that the government cannot tell you what to do, okay? And so one of the first times that it was it was before the court was a case called Olmstead versus the United States. And it was an instance where a criminal was basically engaged in criminal activity on a payphone, okay? And the police were bugging his phone, were wiretapping his phone to listening in his conversation. And he got busted for it, okay? And he got taken to jail. And so he appealed and said, listen, that's a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights of illegal searches and seizures, okay? And so the court ruled that persons, not places, enjoy Fourth Amendment protection. The Fourth Amendment protects people, not places. So it said that basically the police could wiretap a phone booth. Again, most of you, this generation, you don't even know what a phone booth is because you got cell phones, okay? But older generations, you know what I'm talking about, is this idea that within that phone booth, there is a right to privacy, okay? And the court said that you don't have it in a public place, okay? Fast forward to 1965 in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut. At that time in the 1960s, in Connecticut, you had to get a prescription to get contraception. And a married couple decided to get contraception outside of a prescription. And so they ran afoul of the Connecticut law. The couple appealed, and the court said that there is a marital right to privacy, that you cannot prevent a marital couple from obtaining contraception, okay? And so the court added the right to privacy to the list of individual rights enjoyed by American citizens, okay? The court struck down a Connecticut statute prohibiting the use of condom birth control devices even by married couples, okay? The court did not invoke the Ninth Amendment, but it basically, let me just say this, let me stop. There is no right to privacy within the Bill of Rights. But in the Fourth Amendment, there's a prohibition against illegal searches and seizures. In the Ninth Amendment, there is a phrase that says that basically any rights not basically listed in the 10th Amendment, listed in the Bill of Rights, is still granted the American citizens. And so when Justice Douglas, who wrote his opinion, when he wrote his decision, he basically said there are emanations of penumbra. Okay, there's almost like this force field that comes out of the Bill of Rights that extends to American citizens, that gives them a right to privacy. Okay, now a lot of people, as they read this, were scratching their heads going, how do you get that? You kind of made it up out of thin air. And to a great degree, he did. But basically that led to the constitutionality of this idea of a zone of privacy within the Bill of Rights, okay? And the government cannot invade that. Now that logic was used to legitimize and nationalize abortion throughout the country, okay? And so in Roe versus Wade in 1973, using the same logic of the right to privacy, it gave women freedom to choose abortion during the first 3 months of their pregnancy. In other words, within that first 3 months, there is a zone of privacy. Government cannot get in there and regulate or restrict abortion, okay? Harry Blackmun, who wrote the decision, held that privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy, okay? He argued that a fetus is not a person and not subject to constitutional protection. What's interesting about this case is that Blackmun not only justified abortion, okay, that states cannot strike down abortion in the first 3 months of a woman's pregnancy. He didn't just use the right to privacy, but he also spent the summer of 1972 at the Mayo Clinic researching what a person was, okay? And he chose to not look at religious texts or philosophical texts, but relied exclusively on medical or scientific reasoning to come to the conclusion that a fetus is not a person. So it's really, really interesting. In fact, I wrote about this extensively in chapter 7 in my book, where Blackmun, who was raised in a Christian environment, chose to elevate science over the Bible in determining what determines a human being, in this case, a baby in a womb, and Blackmun deferred to science to basically legitimize abortion. Is that science has a concept called personhood theory. Is this idea that you are not a person unless you can live a psychologically satisfying life. And under the logic of personhood theory, and this has been around since the late 1960s, a baby cannot live a psychologically satisfying life outside the womb, so it's not a person, so it's not subject to constitutional protection. Okay, that was Blackmun's logic in which he wrote that decision, and he used the right to privacy to justify that. So I'm going to end right there.